There is no doubt that climate change is ramping up. We're seeing more dramatic impacts of global warming every day, all around the world. But do Canadians need to take any responsibility for all of this? After all, the population of Canada is quite small compared to many other countries. In fact, Canada is only responsible for about 2% of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions. So, do Canadians get a free pass on our responsibility to take swift and decisive action on climate change? This is the question that we'll be exploring today on Green Neighbour. Hello everyone, my name is Art Lightstone and this is Green Neighbour,
a channel where we explore climate change, dissect the conflicting messages we often hear about climate change, and examine ideas we can all use to take meaningful action on climate change.
And hopefully stave off the worst impacts of global warming. Today we're asking if Canadians get a free pass on climate responsibility because of our country's small population, about 38 million people at the time of this recording. So the short answer is no. The long answer is even worse. Canadians actually bear a disproportionately high responsibility for climate change. There are two reasons why this is the case.
First, the planet doesn't know or care about the borders that human beings draw on maps. Nor does it care about the groups that we tend to divide ourselves into and count ourselves within. All the planet responds to is the additional CO2 emitted into the atmosphere by human activity. A 2020 Ford F-150 all-wheel drive pickup truck will emit approximately 372 grams of CO2 for every kilometer it drives. Whether that truck drives in China, in the USA, or in Canada doesn't make a stitch of difference.
The second reason why Canadians don't get a free pass on climate responsibility is because we are actually some of the worst polluters and carbon emitters in the world.
On a per capita basis, Canadians generate far more garbage and much more CO2 than the average global citizen. Canada ranks 40th in the world in terms of population, yet we rank 9th overall in terms of CO2 emissions. And, depending on which data sets you consult, we typically rank between 7th and 4th overall in terms of CO2 per capita. Now, there's obviously a big difference between 4th and 7th place, but that difference is largely attributed to the methodology used in the calculation. Some metrics simply take a country's total CO2 emissions and divide that number by the country's population. Other metrics go a little further to filter out a country's industrial and commercial emissions in order to focus on how much of a country's emissions come solely from its households, a metric that some call average lifestyle carbon footprints.
That is where Canadians really stand out, in a bad way.
In 2021, a Berlin think tank by the name of Hot or Cool produced a report entitled 1.5 Degree Lifestyles Towards a Fair Consumption Space for All. That report studied the consumption habits of 10 different countries and analyzed the emissions generated by the households in those countries, taking a detailed look at household emissions across 5 categories. They are food, housing, transportation, goods, and leisure and services. In every single category, Canadians ranked higher than any of the other 9 countries examined in that study. According to that study, Canadians produced, on average, 14.2 tons of CO2 or CO2 equivalents each year. To put that in perspective, the same study found that people living in the United Kingdom produced 8.5 tons of CO2 per year. Individuals in China produced 5 tons, and the average person living in India produced only 3 tons of CO2 or CO2 equivalents each year. High-income countries naturally have higher living standards and larger average living spaces, and those factors naturally contribute to higher per capita carbon footprints. This is especially the case in Canada and Finland, where large living spaces in combination with long, cold winters increase the overall energy demand. However, the housing footprint is still markedly higher in Canada due to high consumption of carbon-intensive energy, such as natural gas. In contrast, Finland utilizes a district approach to heating and leverages a relatively high share of renewable energy. Now, the hot or cool study from Germany certainly isn't the only indication we have that Canadians are prolific carbon emitters. Worldometer, which analyzed data from a variety of sources, including the Emission Database for Global Atmospheric Research, the International Energy Agency, and the United Nations, found that Canada currently ranks 7th in the world in terms of CO2 per capita, with an average personal carbon footprint of 18.58 tons of CO2. But they employed the more rudimentary method of taking a country's total emissions and dividing that by the country's total population. Thus, countries like Qatar, Montenegro, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates that either produce a lot of oil or depend heavily on coal for electricity, while also having relatively small populations, tend to be much higher than Canada when using this more simplistic approach to calculating emissions per capita. But don't let that fool you. From an individual lifestyle basis, Canadians may very well be the worst carbon and greenhouse gas emitters in the world. Even our own Statistics Canada, following the United Nations system of environmental economic accounting, found that in 2019, Canada's per capita household greenhouse gas emissions were 3.8 tons per person. That sounds great, much better than the other metrics we've been hearing. But to provide us with some context, Statistics Canada itself points out that other countries that follow the United Nations system of environmental economic accounting, such as the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, reported per capita household emissions ranging from 1.7 tons to 2.2 tons for the same year. So even by our own measurements, Canada emits approximately twice as much CO2 per person as other similarly developed countries that have similar GDPs per capita on a purchasing power basis.
There is, however, an upside to all of this. Yes, Canadians punch way above their weight in terms of CO2 emissions per capita, but that also gives Canadians an outsized opportunity to take action on climate.
You see, there really isn't much room for folks in India, Indonesia, or Brazil to reduce their individual carbon footprints by any substantive amount. But folks in Canada have carbon footprints that are more than 4 times that of people living in those countries. That means that, on average, each and every Canadian has the power to effectively remove what would be the equivalent carbon footprints of approximately 3 global citizens.
In summary, Canadian lifestyle is the problem. I'm going to talk more about this issue in a future episode because I really don't want to distract from the core objective of this episode, which is to address a very real belief that some people have, that Canadians don't need to take responsibility for or take action on climate change. I hope I've sufficiently laid that myth to rest and helped you to understand why the only thing that really matters is the amount of CO2 and CO2 equivalents that each of us generates during our time on this planet. But let me close by presenting you with a quote that Donella Meadows wrote in her 1972 book, The Limits to Growth.
People don't need enormous cars. They need admiration and respect. They don't need a constant stream of new clothes. They need to feel that others consider them to be attractive, and they need excitement and variety and beauty. People don't need electronic entertainment. they need something interesting to occupy their minds and emotions. Trying to fill real but non-material needs for identity, community, self-esteem, challenge, love, joy with material things is to set up an unquenchable appetite for false solutions to never satisfied longings. A society that allows itself to admit and articulate its non-material human needs and to find non-material ways to satisfy them would require much lower material and energy throughputs and would provide much higher levels of human fulfillment.
Something to think about from American environmental scientist, educator, and writer, Donella Meadows.
To get some tangible ideas on how to lower your carbon footprint, please visit the Green Neighbour website at www.green-neighbour.com. And I'll point out that neighbour is spelled the Canadian way. If you have any questions, thoughts, or ideas, please drop me a line over email or social media. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn.
I'm Art Lightstone, your Green Neighbour, asking you to take good care.